So here's the Kepler model with a gray matte. Oh, let's just follow along. Gray matte cap. I don't know why I keep losing this thing. Did I? You know what? Did I replace my gray matte cap? I might have when I was dropping this stuff in. No, no biggie. That's fine. This is good enough. You can see the model. Ideally, the volumes and lines are exaggerated to make the character look more consistent across different matte caps here. So now we're going to get into light caps here. So light caps are pretty cool here. So basically, this material here, we've already kind of gone over. We can go in here and add any texture we want to a matte cap, and it looks like, again, I killed my matte cap gray here. But any of these matte caps are being driven by this texture here. So if I grab that star texture, now the matte cap is looking like this, and that is actually a pretty cool comic render if I don't say so myself. I like that. Done. Boom. You did it. So we can do this kind of thing, just replacing this texture here. But let's go ahead and load back in that testing matte cap here. There we go. So next, light caps are very powerful, essentially follow the same principles of matte caps. They're both intended to capture light information. So by using light cap, we're going to be creating our own texture that's going to drive our lighting. So the main difference is that with light caps, you can interactively adjust the light and its properties while you create it. With the matte caps, on the other hand, the light information is baked into a single image. Now, you can start with a light cap and bake that to a matte cap when you're done. But like we were saying at the very beginning, if we do have a matte cap here and we change the lighting direction, it's not going to affect it at all because, again, that lighting is baked into this texture. But by using light caps, we're able to have this texture be dynamic and change the lighting on a matte cap. Is that confusing enough for you? It'll make more sense as we get in here. Although this is a very powerful method to achieve a comic style look, it's not my personal favorite. I chose it to be first in the list discussed because it can give you a very quick and interesting results. So get your creative juices flowing, and you can kind of see, again, how matte caps are playing on your material here. So we'll go back here. Okay, the first thing I want you to do is initialize ZBrush so we can start fresh. So preferences, initialize ZBrush, and then we're going to load the testing hero head Z tool. So load tool, resources, Z tools, testing hero head. And I'll go ahead and drag that out, go into edit mode. And again, if you want to turn that poly paint off, go to your subtool menu, just turn off that little paintbrush there. And then drag it on the canvas, enter edit mode, and dock the light palette on the right or left tray. So the light palette here, we're going to close the material. We're going to grab the light palette and just drag that over here. Also select the skin shader 4. So we're going to go into our material palette here, and we're going to go grab our skin shader 4, which is down here under the standard materials, skin shade 4. There we go. And you should only have one light enabled from the light palette, so go ahead and turn it off. So if you take this light here and we turn that off, that's the look we're going to get. Now you're going to see, we do see this here. So if you go here to the ambient light, turn that down to 0, and that's going to make it a little bit darker, but we can still see the material. And the reason is because the material actually has ambient built into it. So let's go talk a little bit more about that. The reason you can still see the model and some volumes is because the skin shader 4 has a bit of ambient built into it. If you open up the material palette and go to the modifier subpalette, you'll see the first attribute is ambient, and it's set to 15. So let's go to our material, modifiers, ambient is at 12. So we'll go ahead and drag that down to 0, and now we have a pure black model. And then, the background gradient here, if you go to document, you're going to see there's a range. Just go ahead and change that to 0, and that'll get rid of that background gradient. Before we start creating our first light cap, I want you to go to the material palette and click on any matte cap. So we're going to go into here, and you're going to see, even with all these lights off, if we go in here and just grab on any of these, I'll do green metallic, you're going to see, boom, the lights are back on. The lights aren't back on. The lights are still at 0 here, and it's turned off. So if you click this light, it turns the light off. You could also drag the intensity down to 0, but just clicking the light off is easy enough. So what's going on? We've turned all the lights off, or we're still seeing the matte cap. So this is the practical example of some of the things he's been talking about. Matte caps have the lighting information already baked into the image. So we already knew that. So if we go here to the material here and go down to the bottom, again, this image right here is dictating the lighting. The lighting in ZBrush really is only controlling the shadow direction when we hit BPR. Now find the light cap subpalette in the light palette. So here's the light palette. There's the light cap subpalette in here. We don't want to alter any matte cap, but to start fresh, so we're going to select the skin shader 4 material again. And the skin shade is a ZBrush shader, not a matte cap. Click on the new light button in the light cap palette, and you should see something like this. So we'll go back to our materials here, and we're going to go ahead and grab our skin shader 4 that we were playing with. And again, this thing, ambient's completely turned down, and now we're just playing with our light caps. Click on the new light button from the light cap subpalette. You should see something like this. So if we go to new light, we just added a basic light to our light palette here. So we just created a light that's letting us see the volume of our objects. So let's do a quick overview of some of the attributes. The strength is the higher the value, the more light that's diffused from the object. So we take the strength from 0.25 and crank it up, there's more light. If we crank it down, there's less light. Pretty self-explanatory. The shadow slider determines the opacity of the shadows cast by the selected light in the light cap. I will turn this attribute to 0 in most cases when creating a comic light cap. So if you take this shadow down and crank that down, it will get rid of any shadows that are cast. The aperture and fall-off, these two attributes will be the most important ones to create the look we want. So the aperture defines how the light is spread over the model. Think about it as a super concentrated laser beam when you have lower values, or a huge diffuse light box when you're in the higher values. So if you do this aperture here at 90 and we lower it down, now we're getting lower values, and now if we crank this up, it's getting very much just kind of ambient renders. There's at 180, it does look like an ambient occlusion, and then as we crank this down, it gets less and less until it kind of, so let's go ahead and put this back at 80 here. And the fall-off determines the distance covered by the light in the model. For our purposes, the easiest way to think about this is a sharpen blur slider for the area covered by the light. So fall-off at 2, and then there's the sharpen and blur fall-off there. Cool. With all this in mind, set the strength value to something like 1.3. So we're going to kind of blow those lights out a little bit. And the aperture slider to 60. You should get something like this, and I'm assuming that the fall-off slider is probably set back to the default of 2. Looks about right. Now go ahead and change the fall-off slider to 0. So fall-off down to 0, and what do we get? We get a comic style render-ish. Pretty neat. Looks like a little ink drawing that you can just change on the fly here. So from the Lightcap editor preview image, click and drag the little red dot that appears in the middle. This is the light. So our light cap here, so when we hit new light, we got a new light index here. So if I go and click in here, there's a little red dot. So this is actually going to change the direction of that light that we created with all these light properties here. Pretty neat. So if you want to go to high noon, you can make it this way. You can go down below, get a little bit of dramatic Frankenstein rendering here, like so. Note, if you see a bit of gray between the black and white areas in your model, this is because we haven't turned off the specular slider in the material modifier to the skin shader 4. If you want pure black and white, you can just set that specular slider to 0. So if you go back here to the material, and we have the specular, we turn that down to 0. If you crank that up, it looks like we're okay. From this point on, you have two options. So number one, we can keep playing around with the lighting and add some polypaint to your model so you can start getting some colors in your comic book illustration. So if we turn this polypaint colorize back on, you're going to see that with the polypaint, we're getting the rendering, the light cap doing this kind of effect, and then the polypaint doing the heavy lifting on the color side. Number two, you can use the light source as a color of the model and then create a matte cap from the light cap. So instead of having polypaint drive the color, you can also add color to the lighting. A quick example for option number one, position the light in an angle I like, and then assign some flat colors to the hero head, which we already have. Option number two is a bit more juicy, so let's see what we can do. So we're going to keep the polypaint on so you can see how the lights affect the color. In the light cap subpalette, there's a color picker next to the blending mode of the light. So in the light cap subpalette, here's the color picker. This allows you to pick a color for your light source. So I'm going to start by creating a bit of shading. I want to have a strong, sharp shadows, but let's see some details and volumes a bit more. Let's create the base for this material, leave the color in white, and tweak the strength, aperture, and fall-off. Set the value to 1 for the strength, and then 120 for the aperture, and then 1.2 for the fall-off. There we go. So this is, instead of doing a really stark, contrasty render, this one's a little bit more of a soft render here. Now we're going to create a new light. So this is our base, and it looks like we're just going to position this. Let me see if I can just kind of match this. It looks like the light's somewhere in this range, just kind of just vaguely in the middle. Now create a new light from the new light button. You'll be able to cycle between the lights using the light index. When you have multiple lights, make sure you select the one you want to change because the attributes are unique to each light. So basically, as soon as we hit new light, we get a new index, and as we toggle this back and forth, here's light index 1, here's light index 2. And they have their own settings. So we go back to light index 1, there's the aperture of 120, light index 2 gets the default, which is aperture of 90. So the new light will be the specular or highlight, but very subtle. So with these light caps, you do have the diffuse option and a specular option. So, and those drive the different values of this. So we're going to see the new light will be the specular or highlight, but very subtle. I'm going to keep it on the diffuse, but we'll see if we need to switch back to specular. So with the strength at 0.15 and the aperture at 60 and the fall off at 5, I'm going to crank that way up. So light 1, and if we take this light here and we turn that down to 0, you're going to see how we're not getting any specular. As soon as we change this up to 0.15, we're getting a little bit of specular. Let me go ahead and zoom in so you guys can see this a little bit better. So again, strength down at 0, specular gone, 0.15. Here's a little bit of a specular back, and we're using these fall-off values and the aperture values to kind of drive how that specular plays across the surface. Next step is to get some shadows, but instead of enabling them, we're going to use the light itself as a shadow. So we're going to use a black light simply by changing the color to black and then the blending mode to multiply. So are we adding a new light index here? It looks like we are. I'm going to go ahead and create a new light. And with this new light index 3, you're going to see there's the new index 3 slider over here. So if I position this down in the lower left-hand corner and we change this color to black, that's going to create a shadow light here. So let's see. And, blending mode to multiply. So if we go over here to the blend mode, we're going to set this to multiply. And now we're blending this black light. So see, as I drag this light that's black, now we're getting shadows by creating a light and making the color black and setting it to multiply. Now it's a shadow. Starting to see the value of this method, but let's wrap it up and finish by adding a few more lights. The next one is another black light here. Next one is another black light that I positioned at the bottom slightly to the right. So let's go ahead and change, you know what, this black light here that we just made, this index 3, I'm going to go ahead and do, let's see if we can do these settings here. Fall off, I'm going to crank, strength, aperture, fall off. We'll crank that up a bit. Let's see, create a new light. Okay, so let's see, he's got the strength at 0.25 and the shadows at 100, aperture at 84, the fall off at 0. There we go. So the fall off at 0 is going to give you that nice crispy kind of shadow look here. Exposure 1, gamma 1, okay. And back up here. And oh yeah, we need to add another one. So we'll create new light. And let's go ahead and keep these same settings here. So a light index of 4, we're going to drag this down to the lower right. We're going to do an aperture of 90 is probably fine. Fall off at 0, we're going to change the color to black here. And then we're going to go to the blend mode of multiply. And then as we move this thing around, now we're getting that black shading on both sides of the face there. Okay, finally we just need to add a couple more highlights to make the render more interesting. Create another light, the 5th one, and change the color to something like bright yellow. So we're going to go ahead and change new light. We're going to make the color bright yellow. And if you click and drag off your document, you can actually go in here and you can color pick. But we can go ahead and just change this to just a bright yellow. There we go. Change the color like bright yellow. Set the blending mode to replace normal. So in the blend mode here, it's under add by default. We're going to hit replace normal. And then crank the strength up to 20. Play with the aperture and fall off to get a sharp highlight and position the light to the right. So here's the light. I'm going to move this on over to the right. And so now you can see, you know, it's got a soft fall off here. So we change the aperture here. We can kind of make that less or more. And the fall off here. So let's go ahead and fall off at 0. And then positioning the light. You're going to get more and more highlight along the edges here. There we go. So you can kind of get that kind of look. Create one more final light that we'll use as a secondary light source. This time I set the color to blue and moved it to the left. So we're going to create one more light here, new light. Set the color to blue and moved it to the left. So here's the new light. Oops, that's light index 2. So light index 6 here. There it is. Move that to the left. Change the exposure to 6. So instead of changing the strength, we're going to change the exposure. It's basically going to multiply the strength by the exposure number. Exposure multiplies the value of the strength slider, just so you know. So we're going to change the exposure to 6. Cool. And then, of course, we can play the aperture and fall off. So we change that fall off to 0. That'll give us a nice sharp look here. Oops, we're changing. There we go. So just a little bit of blue on the side here. Nice. Cool. That's in a nutshell, the idea of creating light caps. You can also click on the create texture button to bake all of this light work we've been doing. If we do create texture, that's going to bake that into a texture image that you can then go in here with that selected and hit export and just bring this in as an image that you would use for your materials here. So if we hit again the comma key where we copy these materials in, these materials are being driven by basically that image that was created with Lightcap or in Photoshop, which we'll get to in a bit. Alternative, you want to have the ability to further tweak your lights later on. So if you bake this to an image, you can no longer tweak this image unless you go to an image manipulator. I would go and turn that texture off. If you want to maintain this functionality and be able to go like, you know what, I was working on this and I don't like all that much blue, so I'm going to take this blue and kind of shift it over with the light index here and just maybe get a little bit less. If you want that functionality, what you're going to need to do is save the light cap, so all your light settings will be saved. So under here, there's a light cap, go to save, and then you can go ahead and save this light cap out as a ZLD. There's an extra tip I want to share before you're moving on. You don't need to have poly paint on your model. You can actually turn the poly paint off and use the lights to create your shading. For example, see this orange and then the blue shadow and the highlights and stuff. Yeah, if you turn this poly paint off, this is the look you're getting. So if we go back here to our light index of 1, our base color here, and we change this to like orange or whatever, now we're using the colors of the lights to dictate the color of our object. So don't even need to have poly paint. Obviously, you can enhance the render by mixing this method with some of the techniques we're going to discuss in the next section, but I think it'll give you a good starting point for your comic style illustrations. This is Kepler, so let's go ahead and load up Kepler here. There we go, hit F to frame. This is Kepler with the light cap image saved in a matte cap, and I tweaked a bit of the modifiers I mentioned before, like cavity detection and cavity transition. So let's go back to our material here. And cavity detection and cavity transition are in the matte cap stuff. So if we grab, do we have any matte caps in here? Let's go ahead and grab, actually we'll replace Skin Shader 4. Let's go to Sketch Gummy. And then we'll load up any one of these here. This one's fine. Hit the comic key to get rid of that. And like I mentioned before, the cavity detection and cavity transition here. So here's the cavity detection, cavity transition that we talked about before. And now we're kind of changing, the contrast between the peaks of your geometry and the cavities of your geometry. Then there's the cavity color. So, and the detection is kind of changing the contrast between the two. So you can really dial in a really cool look very quickly and really kind of fine tune how contrasty or how much cavity detection you want, and that transition and detection. The detection I really like to kind of just make it a little bit more subtle, a little bit more, softer, like they went in and, airbrush this a little bit more, or used an airbrush brush in Photoshop or whatever.